Something happened just a few days ago that the entire world should have been talking about. But the media covered it for 2 days and then moved on. The most powerful country on earth, the United States of America, sat across the table from Canada and said, "Pay us before we even talk to you. Give us what we want before negotiations begin. Make concessions before you get a seat at the table." And the man on the other side of that table, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, looked America directly in the eye and said, "No. We are not going to make a series of concessions just to get to the table. We are not sitting here taking notes and taking instruction from the United States. We are ready to negotiate, and we are also ready to wait." Now you might be thinking, okay, two countries are fighting about trade. This happens all the time. What is the big deal? The big deal is this. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world. For over a century, these two countries have been the closest allies, the largest trading partners, the most economically integrated neighbors on the planet. America buys more from Canada than from almost any other country in the world. And now the American president is not just imposing tariffs. He is calling Canada's Prime Minister Governor Trudeau. He is saying Canada should become the 51st state of America. He is telling the world that he subsidizes Canada by $200 billion a year. And he is demanding an entry fee, meaning concessions, before trade talks can even begin. And Canada, rather than surrendering, rather than paying that price, rather than doing what small countries usually do when a superpower bullies them, Canada said no. And the man who said no is one of the most remarkable figures in modern politics. A former central bank governor, a man who built his career on numbers, on economics, on data, and he is now standing in front of the most unpredictable president in American history and refusing to blink. So today I'm going to tell you the full story. How did we get here? What exactly is this entry fee? Why did Carney refuse? What is Canada doing instead? And what does all of this mean for the world? Because this is not just a story about two neighbors fighting. This is a story about whether the rules of global trade still apply, whether small countries still have leverage against superpowers, and whether one man's refusal to surrender could actually work. Let us begin. See, before we understand what is happening right now, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to February 1, 2025. That was the day when everything changed. That was the day Donald Trump, freshly returned to the White House for his second term, announced sweeping tariffs on Canada. A 25% tariff on most Canadian imports. A 10% tariff on Canadian energy, which means oil. And a separate 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. These were not small adjustments. These were the kind of tariffs that can reshape an entire economy. And Canada had never seen anything like this from its closest ally. To understand how shocking this was, you need to know what Canada and America mean to each other economically. In 2024, the United States imported more than $412 billion worth of goods from Canada. Canada sends oil, natural gas, steel, aluminum, cars, car parts, lumber, agricultural products, and more to American factories and American homes every single day. The two economies are not just trading partners. They are more like one large manufacturing system spread across two countries. Factories on the American side depend on Canadian parts. Refineries on the American side depend on Canadian oil. Auto assembly plants in the American Midwest depend on Canadian steel. When you impose a 25% tariff on that kind of relationship, it does not just create a tax, it creates chaos. And that is exactly what happened. Canada's response in those early weeks was sharp and fast. Ottawa announced retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods. And within weeks, that number escalated to $155 billion. Canadian provinces, led by Ontario, banned American alcohol from their government liquor stores. Provinces cut electricity exports to American states. Canadian consumers launched a Buy Canadian movement that spread like wildfire. People stopped booking vacations to the United States. They stopped buying American brands. They started checking labels at grocery stores. And the political energy this created was extraordinary. Because at this exact moment in history, Canada did not have a strong leader. Justin Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister for nearly 10 years, was deeply unpopular. His Liberal Party was expected to lose the next election badly. But then something incredible happened. Trump's tariffs and his repeated statements that he wanted to annex Canada, that Canada should become the 51st state, that Trudeau was just a governor of a province of America, all of this outraged Canadians so deeply that the entire political landscape shifted overnight. A country that was tired of its prime minister became a country united against a foreign bully. And into this moment stepped Mark Carney. Mark Carney is not a typical politician. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, and he handled it so well that Britain recruited him to become the governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British person ever to hold that job. He served there from 2013 to 2020 and again guided his institution through major turbulence, including Brexit. When he returned to Canada and entered politics, he was already one of the most respected economic minds in the world. And in Canada's election in April 2025, running on a platform of standing up to Trump, defending Canadian sovereignty, and building a stronger independent Canadian economy, Carney won, and he won decisively. The Liberal Party, which had been headed for defeat just months earlier, came back and won. Because Canadians had decided that this moment required someone who understood how power really works. Someone who had spent decades at the center of global finance. Someone who knew how to negotiate without blinking. Carney's first meeting with Trump at the White House on May 6, 2025, became one of the most watched diplomatic exchanges of the year. In the Oval Office, with cameras rolling and reporters watching, Trump again made his pitch. Canada should become the 51st state. It would be beautiful. It would be great. You cannot even imagine how good it would be. And Carney looked at Trump and said something that became one of the defining quotes of that year. He said, having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign, Canada is not for sale. It will not ever be for sale. Trump replied with his signature 3 words, never say never. But Carney did not smile nervously. He did not try to flatter Trump into backing down. He said plainly that Canadians' view on the 51st state would not change, and then he added something that showed his real strategy. He said the opportunity is in the partnership, what we can build together. He was not slamming the door. He was redirecting the conversation to where he wanted it to go, to trade, to negotiation, to what both countries actually need from each other. But the trade war did not stop just because the two men shook hands. In June 2025, Trump increased steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada to 50%. In August 2025, a 35% broad tariff on Canadian goods went into effect. Canada was being squeezed from every direction. Manufacturing in Ontario and Quebec, the 2 most populous provinces in the heart of Canada's industrial economy, began to slow. GDP growth stalled by the end of 2025. Some economists began warning that Canada might be heading toward a technical recession. The tariffs were doing real damage. But Carney kept playing a careful game. Rather than escalating retaliation endlessly, which would hurt Canadian consumers and businesses too, he made a strategic move in August 2025. He announced that Canada would remove its retaliatory tariffs on American goods that were compliant with the USMCA, the existing free trade deal between the 3 countries. This was a goodwill gesture. It covered about $30 billion worth of American imports. He was saying to Washington, we are serious about negotiating. We are willing to make reasonable gestures. But we need something in return. We need a real deal, not a one-sided surrender. And Washington said no. And this brings us to the entry fee. The USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is the trade deal that replaced NAFTA in 2020. It was actually Trump's deal from his first term. He called it the largest, most significant, most balanced trade agreement in history, and he signed it proudly. But that was the first Trump. The second Trump, the one who came back in 2025, looked at USMCA and called it irrelevant, offered no real advantage to the United States. The deal has a built-in review mechanism. Every 6 years, all 3 countries must formally review it and decide whether to extend it. And the first mandatory review date is July 1, 2026. That means by July 1, 2026, the United States, Canada, and Mexico must meet and agree on the future of this deal. If they do not agree, the USMCA could expire, and North American trade, which is worth trillions of dollars every year, would be thrown into complete uncertainty. The United States Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, has already told Congress that a rubber stamp renewal is not in America's national interest. The Trump administration wants structural changes. It wants changes to how cars are manufactured and what percentage of parts must come from North America. It wants changes to Canada's dairy system, which is heavily protected and does not allow easy access for American milk and cheese producers. It wants changes to how digital services are taxed. And it wants Canada to put American alcohol back on the shelves of government liquor stores across provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, which removed American spirits in retaliation for tariffs. And here is the crucial point. American officials started demanding that Canada make concessions on these issues before formal USMCA review talks even began. Pay first, then we will talk. That is the entry fee. And on April 22, 2026, Radio Canada reported, citing 4 senior sources familiar with the matter, that the Trump administration was indeed setting conditions before negotiations begin. One source said, the Americans are setting conditions before negotiations begin. Another said, we tell Washington, if we make concessions, if we take steps, you will do the same. And Washington is not open to it, at least not right now. Carney's response was precise and firm. On April 22, 2026, he said the United States does not get to dictate the terms of coming trade talks. And on April 23, when asked about the entry fee directly, he said he had never heard Trump use that language, that Trump himself had not raised the concept of an entry fee, that it was not a phrase he had ever used or heard from the American president. He was drawing a distinction between Trump, who he was still trying to maintain a working relationship with, and the hardline demands coming from Trump's trade officials. It was diplomatic precision. He was not calling Trump a liar. He was saying that the demands being reported were not coming from the top, but from officials who were taking a harder line. And then he said something that captured his entire strategy in one sentence. He said, "It is not a case where there is someone making demands and a supplicant. It is not the case that the United States dictates the terms. We have a negotiation. We can come to a mutually successful outcome. It will take some time." And then he said, "We are not going to make a series of concessions. We are ready to go into detailed negotiations. We are also ready to wait if that is what has to happen." That last line is the key to understanding everything. Canada is ready to wait. Most small countries in trade disputes with America cannot say that. They depend too heavily on access to the American market. They have too few alternatives. They need a deal more than America does. But Canada is in a different position, and Carney, better than almost any political leader alive today, understands how to use economic leverage. So what exactly is Canada's leverage? Let me give you the numbers. Canada supplies the United States with more oil than any other country in the world. The United States imports about 4 million barrels of Canadian oil every single day. That oil does not go through a pipeline to some distant refinery. It goes to refineries in the American Midwest, in the Great Lakes region, in parts of the country where these refineries are literally designed to process Canadian heavy crude oil. You cannot just switch to another type of oil overnight. The infrastructure does not work that way. If Canada ever reduced or stopped oil exports to the United States, the lights would literally start flickering in American Rust Belt cities. American refineries would have nothing to refine. American gas prices would spike immediately. Canada has not done this and has no plans to do this. But the fact that it could is a form of leverage that no tariff can erase. Canada also supplies the United States with enormous amounts of electricity. Hydroelectric power from Quebec flows into New York and New England. When Ontario threatened to cut electricity exports to American states during the trade war, governors of those states immediately called their own government, asking Washington to back off. Because consumers in upstate New York and Vermont do not want to pay more for electricity because of a trade fight with Canada. Canada supplies the United States with more than 35% of its uranium supply, which powers American nuclear plants. Canada is one of the world's largest suppliers of potash, the fertilizer that American farmers need to grow their crops. Canadian steel and aluminum, even with 50% tariffs, still makes up a critical portion of what American manufacturers use because the supply chains are too deeply integrated to replace quickly. And on top of all of this, Carney has been building something else. Something that represents a longer-term shift in Canada's strategic thinking. He has been diversifying, actively and aggressively. He traveled to Europe to build new economic alliances. His government accelerated negotiations toward a Canada-ASEAN free trade agreement. Canada launched free trade talks with Thailand and other Indo-Pacific partners. The government's 2026 federal budget laid out a nation-building strategy aimed at reducing Canada's dependence on the American market and strengthening domestic industrial capacity. And internally, Carney passed something called the One Canadian Economy Act, which is designed to eliminate trade barriers between Canadian provinces, barriers that have existed for decades and reduced economic efficiency. The IMF estimated that removing these internal barriers could lift Canada's GDP by nearly 7% over time. That is not a small number. That is a structural transformation. That is Carney telling the world, we are not just negotiating with Trump. We are building a Canada that is more resilient, more self-sufficient, and less vulnerable to whatever the next American president decides to do. But the pressure has been real. The tariffs have not been costless. Canada's manufacturing sector has been hurt. Ontario and Quebec, where car plants and steel mills and parts factories are concentrated, have faced slowdowns and job uncertainty. Canada's GDP flatlined in November 2025, and there were genuine fears heading into 2026 that the country was tipping into a technical recession. Carney responded with fiscal tools. He cut the lowest income tax bracket from 15% to 14%, saving middle-income families about $608 Canadian a year and directly benefiting roughly 22 million Canadians. He announced a $5 billion strategic response fund to support sectors hit hardest by American tariffs. He promised to fast-track major infrastructure projects. He built a parliamentary majority through by-elections in April 2026, giving his government the political stability to pursue this strategy for years without fearing a sudden collapse of his coalition. And through it all, he kept telling Canadians what they needed to hear. The old relationship with the United States is over. We need to chart a new path, but we will not be broken. We will not be bought, and we will not surrender. Now here is the situation as of May 2026. The July 1 deadline for the USMCA review is approaching fast. Both American officials and Canadian officials have acknowledged that a full review will not be completed by July 1. That is now almost certain. The question is what happens after. The structure of the USMCA is that if the three countries cannot agree to a 16-year extension, the deal enters a period of annual reviews, which lasts until 2036, after which it expires. This creates ongoing uncertainty, which is bad for business and bad for investment on both sides of the border. Trump has floated the idea of breaking the trilateral deal into separate bilateral agreements, one with Canada and one with Mexico. The review process actually started with America and Mexico meeting bilaterally in March 2026 without Canada at the table. Canada is watching this very carefully, because being left out of the initial conversations could put Ottawa at a disadvantage when formal trilateral talks eventually begin. And the American demands are significant. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has criticized Canada's dairy protection system, calling the high tariffs on dairy imports unacceptable. He has called Canada's provincial liquor bans on American alcohol disrespectful. The U.S. Trade Representative wants broader rules of origin for automobiles, meaning more car parts must come from the United States or North America generally. Washington wants changes to how Canada taxes digital services companies. And underneath all of this is the deeper American position, which Trump has made no secret about, that the existing arrangement fundamentally favors Canada at America's expense. That the United States is, in Trump's words, subsidizing Canada by $200 billion a year, a claim that economists dispute but that has been effective politically in America. Canada's position is equally firm on its own side. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has said dairy is off the table. Canada's supply management system for dairy, poultry and eggs has been a feature of Canadian agricultural policy for more than 50 years. It supports hundreds of thousands of Canadian farmers. It is politically untouchable. Removing American alcohol bans without getting something in return is something that Ottawa has discussed with provinces including Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, and all three provinces have said they will not back down unless Washington gives Canada something real in return. Canada's position is that it will not make a series of piecemeal concessions, essentially paying the entry fee just to get to the table, only to then face a fresh set of demands once formal talks begin. That is a trap, and Carney is not walking into it. The most likely outcome, according to analysts who follow this closely, is that the July 1 deadline passes without a full agreement, negotiations continue through late 2026, and eventually some kind of revised deal is reached that makes changes to auto rules, possibly some adjustments to dairy access, and addresses some of the irritants around alcohol and digital services, while preserving the fundamental framework of free trade between the three countries. The USMCA is too valuable to all three sides to let it expire. American businesses benefit enormously from tariff-free access to Canada and Mexico. American auto manufacturers and parts suppliers depend on the integrated North American supply chain. American farmers sell billions of dollars of products to Canada every year. American consumers benefit from lower prices on Canadian goods. The economic case for some kind of North American free trade agreement is overwhelming, regardless of what Trump says about it publicly. But the political dynamics are genuinely uncertain. Trump is unpredictable. He has walked back threats before and escalated threats before. He threatened to double steel tariffs on Canada to 50% and then walked it back the same day. He has made extraordinary threats, and sometimes they have come to nothing. But sometimes they have not. And what makes this moment historically significant is that Canada is not reacting to Trump the way America's allies usually react. It is not appeasing him. It is not quietly making concessions behind closed doors and hoping he does not notice. It is building a public record of standing firm. It is building domestic political strength from that resistance. And it is building alternative economic relationships that reduce America's leverage over time. This is the larger lesson of what Carney is doing. He is not just negotiating a trade deal. He is redesigning Canada's strategic position in the world. He is saying that a country of 40 million people that sits on top of enormous natural resources, that is one of the most educated workforces in the world, that produces cutting-edge technology and supplies critical minerals and energy and food to the global economy, does not have to be a supplicant to any other country, even its most important neighbor. Canada has leverage, Canada has alternatives, and Canada has a leader who knows how to use both. For the rest of the world, especially for smaller countries that trade with the United States, the Canada story is important for a different reason. Because if Canada can say no to the entry fee and eventually reach a deal on terms it finds acceptable, it demonstrates that even in Trump's America, negotiation is still possible without total surrender. But if Canada eventually caves, if it pays the entry fee and makes the concessions before talks even begin, then it sends a signal to every other trading partner that pre-negotiation capitulation is the price of access to the American market. And that would change the global trading system in profound ways. So what should you watch for in the coming weeks and months? 3 things. First, whether the July 1 deadline passes without agreement, and if so, how Trump responds. Does he make another dramatic threat? Does he impose more tariffs? Does he threaten to withdraw from USMCA entirely? Or does he quietly let negotiations continue past the deadline without making a crisis of it? Second, whether Canada's provincial governments hold firm on the alcohol ban and dairy protection, or whether political pressure from Canadian business, from the auto industry, from farmers, begins to fracture Ottawa's position. And third, whether Carney's diversification strategy, his efforts to build deeper ties with Europe, with Asia, with the Indo-Pacific, starts to produce real results that genuinely reduce Canada's dependence on American markets over the next few years. Because that third factor may be the most important of all. Canada sends about 75% of its exports to the United States. That dependence is both a source of Canada's prosperity and its greatest vulnerability. If Carney can shift that to 70% over 5 years and then to 65% over a decade, he fundamentally changes the power balance between Ottawa and Washington. He makes Canada a country that does not need to pay anyone's entry fee because it has enough doors to walk through on its own. This is the story that the headlines missed. It is not just about tariffs. It is not just about dairy and steel and aluminum. It is about whether Canada, one of the wealthiest and most stable democracies in the world, is going to allow itself to be remade in someone else's image. Whether it is going to accept that being a neighbor to a superpower means accepting whatever that superpower demands. Mark Carney's answer, stated clearly and calmly in front of the cameras and in front of the world, is no. Canada is not for sale. The negotiations will happen when both sides are ready. The concessions will come when they are mutual. And the result, when it comes, will be a deal, not a surrender. Whether Trump accepts that framing remains to be seen. But what Canada has demonstrated is that even a country without an army large enough to match America, without a GDP even close to America's size, can have a kind of power that does not come from missiles or money. It comes from clarity, from patience, from knowing your own worth, and from refusing to pay before the conversation has even started. The world is watching. And the answer to one of the biggest questions of this era, whether the rules-based international trading order survives the second Trump presidency, may well be decided not in Beijing or Brussels or Tokyo, but across a very long and very quiet border between two countries that have been partners for a century and are now figuring out very painfully what kind of partners they want to be next.